Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, blessed to be joined by my dear friend Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. And as usual, we talk about news and current events in light of church teaching. Matthew, thank you so much for making the time once again. How are you?
Joy to be with you as the summer progresses.
As the summer progresses, and no shortage of interesting news. Now, I need to ask you, do you think you and I can claim a prophetic mantle given that this new piece by Gagliarducci, I always mess up the last name, Gagliarducci, is
Yeah.
exactly the question you and I were talking about the last time we spoke, which is the categorical difference between the SSPX versus the Chinese bishops.
Well, that's absolutely right. And Andrea Gagliarducci asks a really important question. For those who may not be familiar with him, he is one of our EWTN News Vatican experts. He's called a Vaticanista, and he works in the main for Aci Stampa, which is our Italian language news agency. And he reflects on really very interesting diplomatic realities. And this is one of those great crossovers between the diplomatic side, but also obviously the theological, the ecclesiological, and stuff that's just in the news because we have Pope Leo approving the appointment of several bishops in accord with this agreement that dates back to 2018, coming on the heels of the decision by the part of the Society of St. Pius X, or SSPX, to ordain or consecrate four bishops illicitly. So questions asked, well, wait a minute, why are China's new bishops okay, but the ones from the SSPX aren't? And he goes into some great detail on explaining the difference. And I think the overarching point to make is there is a huge categorical difference between the two.
And like you rightly mentioned, categorical, right? And so even when we incur the canonical language of latae sententiae, we know full well that that requires specific conditions to be met. So if I may prevail upon you to just refresh the memory of our listeners as to what those are and why the Chinese situation is different.
Yeah. The first big point is that this isn't simply a question of authority in the sense of, uh, say, favoring the traditional Latin Mass or something like that. There are very significant areas of departure on the part of the Society of St. Pius X beyond simply its concerns about the liturgy. So, for example, the rejection of whole parts of the Second Vatican Council, the conclusions of the Council, they consider them, as Andrea writes, non-binding. But the biggest issue is the question of proceeding with these ordinations without the papal mandate. In other words, at the very specific request that from the Pope, they not do this. So it's in defiance of the rightful place and authority of the Pope. So by ordaining these bishops without that mandate, it is an automatic excommunication, and that you just use that technical term, latae sententiae. Basically, it is the deed itself being done, they are excommunicated. So you are effectively excommunicating yourself. And the Holy See subsequently recognized the excommunication of those bishops. Now, there's been, you and I have talked, there's a lot of back and forth about, well, how far does that extend, that sort of thing. But the simple reality is that ordaining bishops without a papal mandate means automatic excommunication. Now, the big difference that exists then, so people ask, why is China different? Well, the answer to that is that in this case, this is actually an effort on the part of the Holy See to regularize the appointment of bishops, which means that there is no direct challenge to the Pope's authority. And while there have certainly, unquestionably, been egregious efforts on the part of the Chinese government at times to violate this protocol that was agreed upon, it's very clear that, as we have seen in recent weeks, that Pope Leo's approval of several bishops who've been appointed demonstrates that, in fact, the system works and they are recognizing the rightful authority of the Pope. Therefore, these two cases are very different from each other.
And given that they're so different, it's also crucial for us to remember that all of us are gaining all of this information, like, at best third hand. And so there's a kind of submissiveness that we owe to the wisdom of the magisterium, that we can trust that the Holy Spirit is guiding the decision-making processes of the Leonine magisterium.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, there is a lot of effort on the part of some corners in social media to try, regardless of what happens, to defend the SSPX ordinations, to either explain them away or to sort of create these unfair comparisons that they'll make. The simple reality is that Pope Leo's fundamental goal in asking the SSPX not to proceed with these ordinations is because it creates such a breach of unity in the life of the church, that it is rupturing the communion of the church. This 2018 agreement with the People's Republic of China, we have not seen the terms of it, and it has certainly been subject to criticism over the years, including, I think you and I have raised a number of questions about it. But at the same time, it is functioning, and it does at least allow for the bishops to be appointed to hold their mandate from the Pope when it's done right. And I think that, again, those are really important distinctions that we have to make. And all of us need to be informed about the details of this, of why there is this difference. And I think we're going to keep coming back to these discussions about, well, what about this case? What about that case? It doesn't in any way remove or obviate the fundamental problems that were created with the ordinations of these four bishops and the subsequent excommunications and schism that they created, unfortunately.
Not to belabor the point, but just as a very quick addendum and close to that conversation, Matthew, can you also just please speak to the fact that the issues the SSPX has with the church at large is far more than a liturgical problem that is typically claimed reductionistically?
Well, that's exactly right. So we see in a lot of social media, for example, well, why can't they simply celebrate the traditional Latin Mass? They love the old liturgy. Why are you persecuting them for this? When we know that, in fact, there are significantly bigger disagreements than simply the celebration of the old liturgy. If, for example, somebody is deeply fond of the traditional Latin Mass, and I know many, many Catholics who are, there are many places that you can go to attend the traditional Latin Mass and still be in communion with the church. So set aside that question. It's not simply limited to the use of the 1962 Missal or any of the traditional Latin Mass dimensions. In fact, the reality is that the Society of St. Pius X goes well beyond that, into the rejection of the Second Vatican Council, that was the 21st ecumenical council in the life of the church, and therefore has a certain authority. They consider the conclusions of the council to be non-binding, and therefore they are essentially rejecting everything that has happened in the last 60 years since the closing of the council. And in their decision to ordain these bishops, have placed themselves basically beyond the authority of the Pope. They are rejecting the authority of the Pope. So there are huge theological questions that emerge from rejecting the Second Vatican Council. There are huge theological, ecclesiological problems in rejecting the papal mandate. They have rejected the very specific request on the part of the Holy Father, even to delay the ordination so that there could be further discussion. And they are defiant. They're obstinate in their rejection of the rightful authority of the Pope. So for all of those different reasons, as you say, quite correctly, Marcus, this goes well beyond simply a fondness for traditional Latin Mass.
To end this segment on a lighthearted note, LeBron James did not, in fact, attend Mass. We need to wrap up right now. Sorry, Matthew, but we'll continue on the other side of the break. We just dropped a bit of a singer there. LeBron James, no, he did not, in fact, attend Mass in Philadelphia. And we'll talk about this on the other side with Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. And welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President, Editorial Director of EWTN News, talking about church news and current events in light of the teachings and events of the church itself, including the interest of LeBron James attending Mass to the point where the pastor received questions about when the LeBron Masses are. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew. I mean, I've looked through the sacramentary quite a bit. I don't see any votive masses called LeBron Masses.
Well, let's see what happens. You are correct. And this entire flurry of on social media, and in fact, you can find it at ncregister.com. There's a whole article on this because it was such an uproar in social media that the LeBron James mass photo was fake. It says the priest who posted has no regrets. So essentially what happened was that the pastor of Queen of Peace Church just outside of Philadelphia posted a photo on Instagram of himself, apparently, we have to say apparently, posing with LeBron James in front of the altar at his parish. He knew, or assumed anyway, that his parishioners would understand that this is a joke, that this is an AI-generated fake. Now, the problem is that anything related to LeBron James, as we have seen throughout his illustrious, storied career in the NBA, especially the fact that he's now going to be joining the Philadelphia 76ers, became the source of viral reaction to the posting. That was LeBron James actually at Mass? And hence the question became, are there going to be LeBron James Masses? The priest thought that this was simply a fun type of a post to make. And it said, welcome LeBron Mass for Feast of St. James tomorrow at 8 a.m. So not technically a LeBron Mass, but people were reading it as such. And the priest, who has a sense of humor, basically said, I didn't realize that people were actually not recognizing this as the joke that it was.
I mean, this priest clearly has a sense of humor, and he brings his sport fandom to bear in the celebration of the liturgy. Apparently, every year they have a mass for the Philadelphia Eagles, and I think the only thing that ought to be I believe people ought to be reprimanded for is playing on Eagles' wings.
Yes, I could not agree more wholeheartedly about that. Anathema sit, but it does actually raise, I think, an important point, and I'm glad that we're talking about this, and that is that we have to be really careful today with what we're seeing in social media. That there is this assumption, even now, with the prevalence of AI, of what were called at one point deep fakes. Now it doesn't have to be very deep to look like a real thing. The presence of AI, the use of AI can be very disconcerting to people. And you really have to take care when you see an image, we've used that phrase before, what your hot take is. Don't assume that what you see is real, because so often today it's not. And that's especially important when it comes to things that are related to the church. We have seen Pope Leo used in AI images in a host of different ways since his election in May of 2025. And I think this LeBron James mass issue is a perfect example of how we really have to exercise prudence, care, and a certain discernment when we see AI images.
Which is yet another call for caution in terms of how we engage information on the digital sphere without gatekeepers and verifications of that truth. However, we do have something that we know is verified because it came out of the National Catholic Register. It has to do with Pope Leo XIV talking about his love of the United States.
That's right. So the Holy Father he hasn't given too many sit-down interviews, but the one that he did give was to NBC News, and he made that decision. It's his privilege. He does do, as you and I have talked, what are called media scrums outside of Castel Gandolfo. In this case, it was an interview with NBC News at, again, Castel Gandolfo, right after it was called it's a prayer service for peace called the Canticle of Peace at the Borgo Laudato Si, which is, for those who may not be familiar, it's part of the gardens at Castel Gandolfo, and included the great tenor Andrea Bocelli. obviously, it was a conversation that also looked at the fact that he is American born. He was US born, famously, of course, in Chicago. He said something that I thought was really notable. He said, I have great love for America. And you can tell that the way he talks about the United States. But he says, but I understand my mission as having a very important dimension, which is precisely being pastor of a universal church. And he said, I think of myself more as the Pope who happens to be American. So it's a demonstration first of the fact that he hasn't forgotten his roots. That's obvious. The fact that he will happily wear a White Sox cap, for example. But also he understands the historic significance of being the first U.S.-born Pope, first U.S.-born Bishop of Rome, and how he understands that he is also the universal shepherd. So he's being very careful. On the one hand, reminding us that he is from the United States, but on the other, that he is a universal pastor of a truly universal church. And I think that's, again, that it's a classic sort of Leo comment.
And I'm really glad for it too, because he's actually echoed that sentiment throughout his entire papacy, making it very clear to us that while he is American born and raised, he is Catholic first and Catholic last. And therefore he carries that and his Augustinian heritage and deep love of patristic tradition into
Mm-hmm.
his papacy. So thank the Lord for that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the questions that he was asked, because it's uppermost in a lot of people's minds, he's going to Peru in November. Of course, he spent decades there as a missionary, as a bishop, and he has an abiding love for Peru. But he's also, at some point, likely to come to the United States. So he was asked about the possibility of a future visit to the U.S., and he said certainly that that is likely to happen. He said that we're looking at the calendar for the next couple of years, but he said nothing is set in stone yet. But he said, I certainly hope to be there soon. So I think we can anticipate that, yes, there will be a visit on the part of Pope Leo to the United States. And I think if we need any grounds for comparison, I think we would go back to, well, he was certainly not an American, he was a Pole. But John Paul II's first visit to the United States in 1979 was a monumental occasion. It was a historic moment for the life of the Church in the United States. And I really do think that when Pope Leo comes back home, when he comes to the United States for a visit, whenever that is, it's going to be similarly monumental and historic.
I couldn't agree more. And one looks forward to that, which then allows us to move on to a story of a World War II veteran joining the church at 98. It never is too late to hear the voice of the Lord and to say yes.
Yeah, this may be my favorite story of the week. And essentially, he's a World War II veteran, as you say. His name is Raymond Martin Sr. He is 98 years old. And he talks about the fact that he has a connection to Catholicism. It began with his late wife, Anne Marie. And essentially, the two bonded over a shared background that he has with a deacon, Jacinto Trevino, who's a hospice chaplain and an associate at a parish in the Diocese of Tucson. He met with Martin in December 2025, and the two of them, given Martin's long career in the Army, but also 27 years as a police officer, the two of them really hit it off. And obviously, she was Catholic, his late wife, and would attend Mass, and he would go with her and pray the rosary. So it's not like he was a complete stranger to the church. But there was, because of these conversations, because of that relationship that developed, you can see the path that he was on. And it's one of those great moments that he decided to come in. And so he was brought into the church on July 16th. And it's just one of those great stories. And as you said something very notable there too, Marcus, and that was, it's never too late, that you are welcome at any moment in your life.
Truly. And Matthew, thank you so much. I've been talking with Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. And Matthew always finds a way to end on giving us salient advice. And this week is no different. Let us understand that it's never too late to run into the arms of our Lord. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.